probably need to get everybody in position here. We're going to start in just about 2 minutes or so. I'm going to see if I can rustle up some of the people just standing outside. We have as many people online.
Mic check, testing 1, 2. Everybody can hear me? Well, welcome to, I forget what we officially titled it, but it's, this is the Privacy Engineering Panel. My name's John Wunderlich. I'm a longtime privacy consultant in my personal life, and in the pro bono existence, I work on standards, including the one IEEE P7002 privacy data process, which was originally started by the panelists down at the far left, Michelle Dennedy, who if you don't know her name, shame on you. Long-time privacy lawyer and privacy officer in the Valley, and now heading up her own company, which she'll tell us about. Denise, I rehearsed? Schoeneich. I've known Denise for a long time, but she's got one of those names that spells differently than you'd expect it to pronounce, so I apologize. Denise is a privacy engineer at Intel, and to my left is Matt Silveira, who is the current chair of the P7002 work group and the recently released and published standard on data privacy process, which is about incorporating privacy by design into your software development lifecycle. So, next slide, please. Wait a minute, I got it. Here we go. I already did that. I introduced you folks. The agenda for today, going to talk a little bit about IEEE's Digital Privacy Initiative, which is a cross-IEEE initiative on digital privacy, talking not just the standards groups that we're in, but in other practice areas. And then I'm going to, when we talked about this panel, what I said I would do with each of the panelists is talk about a pet project that demonstrates for you how privacy engineering can work, and then we'll have a Q&A involving you. And I don't know if there's a way to get questions from the online audience, but they're more than welcome if there is a way. And then, if time allows, we will go with pet peeves in privacy, and to see if anybody wants to overshare on what there is. I will just frame this up thusly. Digital privacy and social media. If you talk to social scientists, particularly sociologists, you'll find that they frame privacy as the selective disclosure about personal information. It's not about secrecy, it's not about confidentiality, it's not about technical issues, it's about what I choose to share. Selective disclosure, and there's a long literature in sociology going back to Goffman on that, which is a bit different than the way technologists think about privacy as control. And how I've come to think about it for technologists is, if you understand graph theory, privacy is not protecting the node, privacy is respecting the edge. So for those of you that understand graph theory, that might help how we're framing this. So very briefly, I will have to take the mic. The Digital Privacy Initiative is the Digital Privacy Initiative is one of those cross-platform issues that the IEEE does. These initiatives last for a number of years, and the Digital Privacy Initiative is looking at digital privacy needs of individuals rather than the security of data, products, or organizations. And Stu, people will get a copy of this deck, or it'll be available? That'll be perfect. So I don't want to read this, but it's to try and reach across all of IEEE to get the notion of digital privacy across and drive it into the various practices, including things like consumer technology. We have a number of working groups in the initiative, healthcare, connected vehicles, and energy, where we're working, coming to events like this, participating in other industry consortium to get the idea of privacy into that. So I urge you all to go to digitalprivacy.IEEE.org to take a look at the initiative, and there may be a place for you there. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Michelle Dennedy to introduce herself and talk a little about her pet project.
How about that? Hello. Thank you, and thank you for coming out, and thank you everyone who's hanging in there on Zoom yet again for now, 3 years running pandemic-wise. My name's Michelle Dennedy. I am currently the CEO of a company called PrivacyCode. It is the, hopefully, period on the sentence, lifetime sentence in privacy, starting out with patent law. And I started off at Sun Microsystems as their first chief privacy officer right after Scott McNeely said, "You have zero privacy," topping it off with a hearty, "Get over it." That statement was actually made with the introduction of Jira, not Atlassian Jira, but this is actually a Java-based wireless connection between your laptop and a printer. So you could print things wirelessly, and a journalist said, "Oh, Scott, this will be the end of healthcare privacy. You can print things, anyone can print anything on any printer. This is an atrocious thing." And he said, "You have no privacy anyway, get over it." And so all of the adults in the room went that way, and all the Dennedys in the room went this way, because there's a belief that in a system of morals and society and law and culture and machines and technology, there should be a center that is privacy engineering. If privacy engineering can be conceived of as the authorized processing, whether it's sharing or storing or having or analyzing or creating information related to, according to moral, ethical, legal, and sustainable principles. So if you look at the world through a lens such as that, and you look at the mountainous problem of privacy engineering, is it a fallacy? Or is it something that we simply need to look at as a wicked problem, multi-stakeholder, zero end, every problem almost creates a new conundrum, lots of technology, lots of bandwidth creates maybe the possibility of curing disease, definitely the possibility of creating friendships between a 12-year-old in Silicon Valley and a 12-year-old in Iceland, but the problems of disinformation and upturned elections and all sorts of havoc and harm. So you have to look at these as continual systems, and so the way we look at it at PrivacyCode is privacy engineering isn't something magical. There's no automated compliance. If anyone is trying to sell you a license to anything that is automated compliance, please slap them hard and send them my love. PrivacyCode is about breaking down mountains into conceivable, measurable tasks. We want your identity people to do identity things in the name of privacy. We want your database people to do database things in the name of privacy. We want your systems people to do systems things in the name, and your process people to do process things. And at the end of the day, you should have what I call a privacy bill of materials, so that your privacy officer, such as the lovely Denise over here, can look at that bill of materials and critically interrogate it and say, does it still fit? Because remember, the system is old the minute it is launched. And so that's the way I look at the world, and after Sun Microsystems came Oracle, came McAfee Intel, came Cisco, and now Startuplandia. So with that, I turn it over to my former, much smarter than me, colleague, Denise.
Hi, my name's Denise Schoeneich. I'm a privacy engineer at Intel in the Privacy Strategy and Operations Group. My focus area is privacy in new cutting-edge technology, including AI. So I'd like to share with you today a little bit about one of my pet projects where we moved privacy and privacy engineering forward. It's called the Intel Visual Sensing Controller. This controller is part of Intel's Evo platform. It employs face and head orientation algorithms to potentially increase battery life, system responsiveness, and security gains. Let me tell you a little bit about some of the features. So we have a feature that wakes the system up and triggers user authentication when a user approaches the system or opens the laptop lid. It dims the display when the user's not looking at their screen. The system will lock when the user walks away from their laptop, and it doesn't wait for your inactivity timeout expiration. And then lastly, one of my favorites is it prevents the system from locking or your display turning off if it detects user presence or user engagement. So about 3 years ago, the product team engaged with their BU attorney, our Intel AI privacy and security attorney, and with me to discuss their product. Our main concern for this product was the use of Intel-enabled artificial intelligence to sense and adapt to the laptop surroundings. So we worked with them, developed mitigation strategies to reduce the privacy risks in the development of the algorithms, the system design, and the deployment of the controller. So on the right-hand side, you will see Intel's 5 privacy principles. On the left-hand side describes how these controls were implemented. So the user can enable or disable their camera by the touch of a button. We also have LED lights, red to let them know that their camera is disabled, blue when the OS or an application accesses the camera, and it will flicker for when the camera is used for facial detection, not recognition detection. I think there's a clear distinction between the two. The purpose, I explained a little bit about this before, but essentially this is a companion chip and firmware that controls the camera. And it provides human presence as well as attentiveness to deliver increased battery life and system responsiveness. The way minimization and deletion were implemented, the face and the head orientation is processed in real time on the device. No data is stored on the device. It's not sent to the cloud for processing or stored in the cloud. Intel and the OEMs do not have access to the face data, and it does not have facial recognition capabilities. For security and access limitations, the product follows Intel's secure development lifecycle, which makes security and privacy an integral part of the product design, definition, development, and validation. So accuracy and accountability, the product team engages with me every time they have a new feature. They've also happen to be in Poland, and we have other teams, members of other teams in Poland that do wake on voice, wake on face, and other user interactive algorithms and models. It became very clear, you need to talk to Denise. I constantly receive, meeting invites. Hey Denise, we got this new feature, we want to do this. What are the privacy concerns? Please help us. So that's how I feel that this product has really been the catalyst of driving privacy and privacy engineering forward.
Thanks, Denise. Matt.
Thanks, John. And I wanted to thank the IEEE and Katina for inviting us today. It was very gracious. Background is in terms of cybersecurity and privacy. Most recently, in terms of privacy, has spanned about a 5-year period where I've worked in the space of cloud consulting for large agencies like the state of California's Child Welfare Service System and Department of Health and Human Services for their COVID analysis, as well as large healthcare spaces. So I'm here to talk a little bit about a project I recently worked on, I'm working on right now, in terms of child welfare. And it's an interesting system because it's multi-cloud. It uses Salesforce as what they're referring to as their CRM or their relationship management engine. It uses Snowflake to do data analytics. It uses Adobe Cloud for documentation on specific child engagement cases. It uses Office 365 for a variety of productivity tools and so forth. You can get the idea. And I borrowed this little graphic from John, who in another presentation put it together, because I think it explains something that's crucial when we talk about privacy engineering to DevSecOps people. You'll notice I didn't inject the word privacy in there. We're still fighting to get full equivalency and first right ticket status in that DevSecOps space. But I win them over using something that I saw a number of years ago waiting to get some tractor parts at a freight depot. And there were a series of posters with some really horrendous truck accidents, and then some really mundane things like air hoses and truck tires and engines. And every poster at the top said, "Know the why." And I thought, wow, that's pretty far out. You know, I grew up on a farm and I understand some of this stuff and some of it I don't understand. So I asked the depot master, and he said, you know, this is how we engage everybody. So we have a shared appreciation and understanding of what we're doing here for safety. And I thought, wow, that's brilliant. And so I like to start that conversation out immediately with my teams so that we have an understanding of know the why. So as we're looping through this Mobius strip or this little loop, we can understand every point along the way why privacy is important and why it's important to do a privacy and impact analysis, what type of information is federated or shared, and what type of trust relationships have been established, and whether or not we fully know them or they're transient. Because once we get to that, I think something good happens, which is it helps us combat against two things, which I read about from a very brilliant woman named Diane Vaughan, who wrote a book about the space shuttle and called Challenger Disaster. And she brought up two things that were very interesting that I think impact us all in this DevSecOps Mobius strip. One is a failure of imagination. And folks today, especially when we talked about the session that preceded us, about using our imagination to understand how to cope with things is vital, and engaging other people and understanding how those decisions about privacy and data may have unintended outcomes. And then the other along this strip is critical because there's a key indicator that if you see it, you should go immediately and do a deep dive on it. And it's what she refers to in her book as the normalization of deviance. Whoa, big term. I'm going to break it down and keep it real simple. And it goes like this. There's a known state for safety. So like in an aircraft, we're going to check the fuel gauge and we're going to check the fuel in the tank with a metering stick. And if they both say full, we're good to fly. But if the pilots are lazy or the ground crew's lazy and like, you know what, we got to get this bird up in the air. Fuel gauge looks good, good, you good, good, good. Don't put the stick in the tank. Get it going. Well now, hey, guess what? Plane flew, plane landed safely, nobody died. Now we have a normalization of deviance. We've accepted the new normal as not doing that dual check. I think that's a problem, especially when it comes to privacy controls. So if we're doing our job here, we can look for these things, and then ultimately having folks with a shared knowing of the why come up with some good solutions. I don't pretend to have all the answers. I don't at all. But I do believe that if we're paying attention to those things, problems that we find fraught with multi-cloud privacy issues can be resolved in a way that's meaningful and manageable. Thank you, John.
So, before I start pestering my panelists, are there any questions or concerns in the audience that anybody wants to bring up? I should have known better. Alan.
So on the Intel face detection thing, it's clear that you don't need the high-resolution camera. In fact, I have a shutter over my camera. Wouldn't it be better to have a camera with barely enough resolution to do what you need, and then I would have assurances that you're not doing more?
Thanks.
True. Thank you. True, but understand, this product, Intel delivers to an OEM. So we have no control over the hardware. So we're building in our privacy controls in the firmware for.
Could you provide a fuzzy shutter that they would also ship along with the machine?
That would be the OEM. Again, I'm not, Intel's role is developing the chip. But, one of the things is, as I mentioned, we also use user engagement. So you don't even need the camera. It still works. My mouse, my keyboard, I sit
there and read for 10 minutes and my screen.
It will, this technology, if you're using it, again, user presence or, engagement, it will not lock. Because I agree, when you've got a long document and you're trying to read, and the worst thing is your screen turns off.
Of course I'm not moving, I'm reading, you idiot. Right? Well, that brings up, I think, something that comes up in privacy a lot more than other areas of technology, which is the question, yes, you can do a thing, should you do a thing? Right? That's a big issue in privacy and privacy engineering. One of the ways, if you think about privacy as I get to control information about me, then a family that may be one of the best practitioners of privacy are the Kardashians. Because they're, as much as they disclose, they take very close control over what's disclosed and how. You may not want to know all the stuff that they share, but that's their choice, right? So the other side of the graph theory is just because you want to share doesn't mean I want to know. So I never turn into.
I want a Kardashian shield.
So, but we've talked about, we've got lawyers on the panel and we've got technologists on the panel. And when I go to privacy conferences, especially where there's lawyers, some lawyers get really upset at me, and you'll know who I'm talking about, Pamela, because I present myself as a privacy consultant and I'm not a lawyer. That's just unacceptable. For some lawyers, privacy is completely a legal issue. And for some technologists, privacy is completely a technology issue, which sort of begs the question for those people, is the phrase privacy engineering an oxymoron in the same sense that military intelligence is an oxymoron for a number of people. I'll kick it off with Michelle, if she'd like to respond to that sort of two solitudes kind of idea.
I would, actually, and the term privacy engineering was one that was really popularized, actually, by my father, Tom Finneran. We wrote the book together. It's called The Privacy Engineers Manifesto. Myself, Tom Finneran, and Jonathan Fox, who worked with the lovely Denise and I when I was back at McAfee Intel. My dad started out in the US Navy, Standard Oil, Corning Glass. He was the roving big data center security guy. And when Ann Cavoukian had really popularized privacy by design, I went to India and I was talking to our developers and I was trying to develop a B2C product that would hit hundreds of millions of consumers simultaneously. And I went and I told them the principles and I talked passionately about the rules and how you might want to use a fuzzy screen and you might want to try this and you might want to do this and there's going to be some convenience things, so let's do this over here. And I fly all the way back home again, and 6 weeks later we called to check on the project and they said, well, we're not done with the project. Why are you bothering us? We'll call you when we want the policy written at the end as almost a disclaimer. And so I went back and, as you do, even though I was in my 40s at the time, I called Dad, why are these people not understanding me? Because he was an engineer. And he said, you're not speaking their language. And I said, what language would they speak? And he said, they speak engineerese. So how do we take privacy by design and do we translate it into engineerese? And so we really went back to the roots and we took UML and we took data modeling and we looked at how do you break down privacy laws and principles and the fair information practices and do that core translation. And that's when we called it privacy engineering, not because I'm not an engineer by training, but because an engineer in the old-fashioned, when we used to have professional engineers like civil engineers are now, they would sign a code, and the code of conduct would include ethics. So you wouldn't build a bridge to last 5 years, and you would also contemplate trucks as well as family cars, and you would look at the materials around you, you would look at the problem to be solved, and you would solve it in a system, in a situation over time, and you would have disclaimers where you would have policies, you would have technology, you would have people. So when we called it privacy engineering, it was a nod to PE, which was privacy engineering, which was professional engineer. So I very much, not only do I believe that privacy engineering is not an oxymoron, I know, I've practiced. I have a company called PrivacyCode because it's a code of conduct, it's a code of practice, it's a way of living, it's a way of being, and it's a way of building a better society if everyone looks at themselves and says, hey, I have a personal story to tell about myself, my family, my business. What if I engineered a better way of practice? And then if you have the particular skills in technology, bravo, brava. If you have the particular skills in deciphering the billions of tons of words that we're throwing at you in the legal world, and we're purposefully making them obscure because we're trying to solve for tomorrow's problems that we haven't caused yet, then you come to the middle, and there comes that professional engineer, and they just look, and there's a hill, and there's a hill, and there's people that want to get from side to side. And you break it down beam by beam, brick by brick, task by task, sprint by sprint, and you meet in the middle. And that's what privacy engineering is.
Stu.
Well, we have a unique combination of talents up there at the table, and I'm going to see if I can cut across some of them. So I will confess I'm not an attorney, I'm an engineer. And I'm trying to get my head around privacy by design, but I know about security by design. And security and privacy are kind of dualities of each other. If I design a secure system so that people can't break into it to put malware in, or I can detect through some sort of means the fact that the person at the other end is not who they pretend to be and that sort of thing. So I guess when you think about privacy by design, how do you relate that to things you would throw over the wall to us as engineers of what I would call security by design, which we know how to do, I think. We're learning how to do anyhow.
Denise, I think I'll throw that, because you're still in the bowels of the big corporate beast. I'm wondering, in terms of the structures or organizations at Intel, how do you address that?
So as I mentioned in my presentation, Intel uses a secure development lifecycle. There are unique tasks that are assigned specifically to privacy. So number one, privacy impact assessment. But then you go in and there's those controls that once we've defined the requirements for privacy, that becomes part of the overall requirements for the system. And it goes through the requirements, it goes through privacies in the design, Privacy is in the validation and the final deployment. So some of the controls are security controls, but there's also controls that are unique to privacy. So that's how we incorporate privacy and security in what we're calling the secure development lifecycle.
I'll add to that. In my experience with some enterprises, agile programming, if you're not careful, can be the death of privacy by design, because you get a project manager or a scrum master and you give them a bunch of non-functional requirements, because some of the privacy requirements are functional, but a lot of them are going to be non-functional requirements. And for some reason, in the rush to get to MVP, all the NFRs just get pushed back, and they're never addressed in a sprint. So if you're a privacy engineer like Denise in a large company, part of the job is doing the translational work that Michelle talked about to make sure that the NFRs and the privacy requirements are part of every sprint, so that when you get to MVP, you're also got minimal viable privacy. So I just wonder if you wanted to add to that at all.
I do. Thanks, Sean. To tap a little bit more on your question about security by design versus privacy, we've all been on that journey, and I certainly transitioned myself in that process a number of years ago, so keep with it. In terms of John's point, I think it's really important to understand, both from a security by design and privacy by design perspective, that we have to make the functional and non-functional requirements all first-class citizens. We can't have the privacy be subordinate to the security, or to just, let's get the release out the door, which always just is a jangling sound in my head whenever I hear that. But that isn't to say that you can't help people understand the complexities around privacy controls. For example, data minimization. I had this conversation just yesterday with our child welfare team about this concept of creating a dual system. So they wanted to use Salesforce to query the system, which has a somewhat strict role-based access control model. I'll say somewhat because some of it's discretionary access-based. And then they said, oh, but we're doing this really groovy thing with solar over here. And you can just go to the web page and throw a query in and stuff comes up. And I said, oh my goodness, you know. But in starting the conversation around the why, we quickly realized they were trying to augment some functionality that wasn't available to them in Salesforce, but had engineered this opposite solution, which was contrary to privacy minimization, right? Because it would show virtually any unstructured data. If you threw a query in for Matt Silveira, it would show that I live in Placerville and have 3 cats, and show a picture of my cats and my truck and a bunch of other stuff. And I said, no. But I think that that's where the rubber meets the road, John, is understanding how to explain those controls, and then understanding that the controls are going to be both sometimes a technical and engineered control, and sometimes an administrative control, like a policy. But they have to handshake. And to Denise, to Michelle's point, you can't do the master policy control at the end. That's really broken. When you see something like that, it's a chronic issue.
Yeah.
Can I add one more thing, John, quickly?
Maybe even 2.
When I do the security versus privacy thing, first of all, it's never versus, it's part. Think of Alice and Bob. Alice and Bob have a backstory in privacy. In security, they're just being secured. There's either a bad guy or negligent guy disrupting that communication. In privacy, they have a backstory. One's at the doctor, one's a provider, one is a voter, one is a Diebold system. That creates the context, and the context is the story is the privacy, and that sets the conditions, that sets the appropriate levels of security. So if you're doing privacy well, you're actually doing security better.
I will note that I have a blog post somewhere that Alice and Bob's relationship is broken, but that's a whole different
Oh
thing.
yeah, they need therapy. We have a psychologist.
We have a question online.
So I am actually monitoring the chat for anybody who's also listening. Put some more one in. This is from Sin Kuen Hawkins, who actually is the person responsible for putting this panel together at IEEE. So her question is, can you speak about what tools we could provide or need to develop to allow consumers to better manage their privacy rights?
You got about 3 hours? Hi, Sin Quen. Does somebody want to take that on first, or?
You know, when we talk about consumerization or consumer products and services, it really runs the gamut. And I think that I'm not going to address this from the perspective of your iPhone or your Android or something like that. I'm going to address it from a perspective of consumer-driven technology that's been repurposed or reharnessed. And when we do those types of things, like I'll pick on my project, Salesforce CRM for child welfare, we have to think about and constantly keep track of the context of that subject, of that child, and understand when we talk about that data life cycle and flow model of privacy life cycle, how we're going to handle each stage of that transaction in an appropriate way. And I think that oftentimes when you take products to market, especially consumer products, right, they're all disposable. I mean, that iPad I brought, this iPhone, it's really just Kleenex, right? Made of silicone. When I'm done with it and it's old, boop, goes away. There's not a lot of consideration given for consumer privacy. I would urge us to reconsider that, especially when we think about it not just from the front end user experience, but more explicitly from the back end, where there's massive amounts of this information that's being federated and shared between large cloud service providers, not just for transactional purposes, but for business data intelligence gathering purposes.
Yeah, I guess I'd say there's two elements, in my view, to responding to that. One is buyer beware, right? People don't buy the Brooklyn Bridge because they know that that's a bogus offer, hopefully. But there's a second element to this. Sorry guys, I'm going to pick up one of your mic. When you go to the store and buy an electrical appliance or something that's hooked up to the power, you don't go home and get your multimeter and say, and open it up and say, does this ground properly? Is this safe to use? Because there's an electrical building code, CSA Labs, UL, Underwriters Library. There is no equivalent privacy, right? So as much as GDPR, last best gasp of a set of data protection rules based on a 1970s view of technology, or PIPL, the Chinese equivalent, to just fine, what was it, 1.2 billion won to Didi. So those are good in sort of reactive, but there's no digital building code. So Sin Quen's question highlights what needs to be done on the policy level, which is a digital building code or a third type, like a proactive digital privacy to protect consumer. There is ISO TC 317, which is consumer privacy, which is privacy by design as an ISO standard, but it's still not going to a company like insert social company name here and saying, before you build X, here's the privacy requirements that you have to build in when you're building it. The same way when you're doing a renovation on your house, you have to use 14 gauge aluminum wire for this kind of voltage because you can't use copper wire anymore, or whatever it is. I don't know. Denise, any thoughts from you?
You know, when you say buyer beware, so I do also review, I have BUs that I support. So I often will review, they want to use a third-party service. I looked at, they wanted to use a photo sharing app. And basically, because they take pictures at their events and they want to share them among their, the people that attended. So they basically could take this app, have a QR code, provide a password so everyone could access their photos on their mobile phone. I looked at the privacy notice. There was no privacy notice. So I looked at the terms of use. They talked about privacy, how they use it. It was, standard, general. But what really hit home was the security. They said that there were risks in the transfer of data, and that you, as the user of that photo sharing app, accept all risk. So I think that hits home to really kind of buyer beware.
They start waving the flag. I'll give you a contrarian thought, which is not always popular, but advocate for a federal law in the United States of America. A federal law. I live and work in California. It says the words do not sell. You can walk up to any television in this hotel and ask it for a ham sandwich. You will not get a ham sandwich. You can ask every company in the valley, do not sell my information. You know what they're not going to be able to do? Not sell your information. Wasn't built that way. There's no incentive to start to build it that way. And that's being a little bit overbroad, but not a lot.
On the hopeful side, which is strange for
We
me.
do have a draft.
Yeah, we'll cross your fingers, knock on wood. One of the things that gives me hope are some of the standards that are working your way through, and I urge all of you to stick around for Kalia's presentation at 2:10. Hey, Kalia, where she'll be talking about some digital identity standards. Decentralized identifiers just got approved last month, now that it's August, on W3C, verified credentials, and the whole notion of self-sovereign identity. Those give me hope. Yep. What my pet peeve is the magic wand of consent. Right? It's when I advise companies, I tell, and I'm a privacy guy. We're often surprised to say, if they're a European company, there's six base hiring or for collecting personal information that's legitimate under the GDPR. Legal, I won't go through the whole list, but like police warrant or consent. And I tell every one of my clients, the last one you should use is consent, because it's the hardest to operationalize, it's the hardest to implement, and if one of your customers says no and you process it anyway, you're in a world of hurt, right? So you have to decide some things we just shouldn't do, and then are these things consentable? There's a great book I was talking to Michelle about earlier called Consentability. Like, I can't consent, trigger warning, I can't consent for a child to be trafficked, right? Or to be used for nefarious purposes. That's not something for which, even though I'm the parent of that child, I can give consent. The same thing applies to, I can't consent to invasive procedures on my own self. Some things are not consentable, but the way who knows that line in Princess Bride? Do not think that word means what you think it means. That's consent on the internet. Because I sit on the Sick Kids Research Ethics Board. When you give consent for your child to participate in a study, it's a 10, 15, 30-page document. Somebody sits down with you. If there's genetic testing, a geneticist sits down with you, a genetic counselor. You understand what the risks are before you give consent. How many consents do you have to give on the web? Consent is the way it's used, consent is inherently a dark pattern on the web. That's my pet peeve. I don't know.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think some of the presentations even today, when we talk about EULA agreements and the 1,000-page shrink-wrap EULA agreement just to get to the website, just to look at the service manual to get his truck going, is indicative of the scenario. And it's a dark path for another reason that was brought up in some earlier talks, because the company that's making that assertion may not even be fully aware of all the transitive trust relationships or implied data transport relationships they might have to other partners. You know, I'll give you a classic example, and it's a real example. So in the same system that I'm working on, we use Splunk Cloud, and we thought it would be a whiz-bang idea to take all the virtual private cloud flow logs, VPC flow logs, and feed them into Splunk. Well, lo and behold, one day I'm doing my homework as a privacy guy and auditing things and reviewing things, and I said, well, this doesn't line up with our privacy impact assessment because there's PII in the data. Now, going back to AWS, their answer was reasonable. Well, hey, that's shared services model, that's your stuff, not our stuff. But it broke down because it went multi-cloud. So I think you're completely correct. Yeah, the consent thing's a dark pattern, even when it's person to person or person to corp or corp to corp.
Yeah, legitimate interest is a much better basis, and you can do a lot of stuff, and customers will understand if you explain it to them. I don't know, pet peeves?
You know, my pet peeve, and I think Michelle touched on this, is AI. There is no standards for AI, sorry, but, you know.
I'm still looking for the I.
Yeah, I know, exactly. So I think that's my pet peeve. I know that EU has an AI Act coming. There are regulated industries such as aviation, automotive, medical devices, that it's more sectorial. You even have laws like, for example, Illinois has a Biometric Information Protection Act on using your biometrics. So it's just, there is really no standards out there.
AI is a mediocre white male. It keeps failing upwards.
You did not hear that from me, John.
Just wanted to save you the trouble. Do you have a pet peeve?
I might have said that out loud, but I did not say that. My pet peeve, well, apart from people not buying more licenses in PrivacyCode, I will say that out loud. I think it is, there is a certain learned victimhood. That is my biggest pet peeve. I hear from people saying, oy vey, no privacy, oh, security's so hard. And then you go to them and you say, let's get someone from legal, someone from technical, get a product manager together, let's like simulate a tiger team at least. Oh, I don't have any budget. Excuse. And then I see you bouging it up at a conference. Sit down at a table together. We have Zoom now. We've got WebEx. I still have stock in Cisco. Get some WebEx. Sit down and have a conversation about what good looks like. What is better? So if you have a beef, figure out what is better. And if you can't do that at your company, start a new one. Yeah. Because there's a lot of privacy tech that needs to happen. All the dollars don't have to go to this weird Web3. JLINC Labs was done. Some of us are old enough to have been there. Privacy tech is just starting now, and we have to prove that there's a market and builders that are willing to build. It's more than the people that are in the symposium that are willing to build. So grab someone by the elbow and let's start building. It drives me absolutely bananas how big this problem is and how few are willing to just get off their chair and do anything about it.
I will leave us with this thought because we got 1 minute left. Privacy engineering is a test of the competency of your engineering staff. Another one of my pet peeves is data deletion, especially in databases. You go to a company and say, do you delete the data according to your retention schedule, if they have a retention schedule, at the end of 7 years or whatever it is, and they say yes. And then you drill down and say, are you marking it deleted in the database, or are you actually deleting the data? Almost invariably, they'll say, we're marking it deleted in the database. And I say, no, because I used to work for a regulator, and I've talked to every regulator I know, and you say, does that meet your standards? And they say, no, it does not. You have to physically delete it. And then you go back to the text, and they say, we're not, what I'm pretty sure is underlying is, we're not completely sure of our design of our relational database, and we think we may break things if we start actually deleting records. Because the design was fast, they got to MVP too quickly, and they never did all the testing. So doing privacy right is probably the best way to determine if you've got high quality engineering teams. And I think that's about it.
He's coming for your mic.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you so much for the panel members. And one person who's not here, who I mentioned earlier, who actually organized this for us, is Sin-Ku Ann Hawkins. She's with the Digital Privacy Initiative at IEEE. And I guess I took down the slide here that was up here a moment ago, but that is an open activity that you can engage in, and the email address was up there a moment ago. Maybe guys can put that last Q&A slide back up again. There you go. Digital privacy at digitalprivacyinfo@IEEE.org. So can I ask the next group of panel members come up, and thank you so much, folks.